Imagine a country so small it could fit inside the borders of a single American city. A country that just 150 years ago was a poor, forgotten piece of land, known mostly for poverty and obscurity. And yet today it is one of the richest countries in the world, where people live at the level most of us can only imagine. How did that happen? How did a tiny principality on the edge of the Alps turn into a financial powerhouse that competes with Monaco for the title of the wealthiest country on earth? To understand that, we need to go back in time. It's the year 1867. Russia's preparing to sell Alaska, a cold and distant territory that will soon become part of the United States. But before that deal was finalized, this vast frozen land almost ended up in the hands of one of the smallest countries in the world. That country was Liechtenstein, a state roughly 11,000 times smaller than Alaska and located almost on the other side of the globe. A country so small that many people would struggle to point to it on a map. You might wonder how such a tiny landlocked country, surrounded by other small states, could even consider such a purchase. The truth is that at the time, Liechtenstein was in terrible shape. It was a poor and forgotten remnant of the Holy Roman Empire, so economically weak that the ruling princely family had to sell some of their most valuable works of art just to stabilize the country's finances. Today, however, Liechtenstein is an economic phenomenon. Its GDP per capita reaches about $170,000, and it is the only country in the world with no external national debt. How did a small Alpine valley of poor farmers transform into one of the wealthiest places on earth? Was it genius, luck, or something else entirely? In the mid-19th century, Liechtenstein, a tiny principality covering only about 61 square miles, somehow survived the massive political upheavals that reshaped Europe. The collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, the fall of the Confederation of the Rhine, and the rise of a unified German state all passed by this small territory almost unnoticed. The reason was simple. Liechtenstein was too poor and too insignificant for anyone to care. In fact, the ruling princely family didn't even bother to visit the territory for more than 120 years after acquiring it, mainly to gain political status within the Holy Roman Empire. The first ruler set foot in Liechtenstein only in 1842. Although the principality remained formally independent, it was far too small to survive completely on its own. Over time, it entered a customs union with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and relied on the much larger neighboring economy for food and basic goods. That arrangement had one unexpected advantage. It attracted Swiss textile manufacturers who began opening factories in the principality, marking the first signs of industrialization. But progress was slow. Liechtenstein's rugged Alpine geography made transporting people and goods difficult and expensive. Then disaster struck. World War I nearly destroyed the tiny country. Even though Liechtenstein remained neutral, its close ties with Austria-Hungary caused the Allied powers to treat it as an enemy ally, placing it under a strict economic blockade. Food supplies stopped arriving. Seasonal work abroad, which had helped many residents survive, disappeared. And when Austria-Hungary collapsed, Liechtenstein suddenly found itself completely cut off, without a stable currency, without economic support, and without the resources to survive. Swiss textile factories shut down and left the country. To make matters worse, debts accumulated during the war for imported food from Switzerland placed an enormous burden on the already fragile economy. Liechtenstein, already poor, was now on the edge of collapse. Its people face hunger and uncertainty. But sometimes the deepest crises create the conditions for something entirely new. After World War I, Liechtenstein had lost almost everything: the support of Austria-Hungary, economic stability, and even its monetary foundation. Instead of giving up, the tiny principality made a bold decision. Realizing it could not survive economically on its own, Liechtenstein formed a new alliance with Switzerland. For Liechtenstein, this partnership was a lifeline. For Switzerland, it was more like a rescue mission than a partnership of equals. Yet the small size of the principality made the arrangement manageable, and stabilizing a neighbor in such a strategic location brought certain benefits. Liechtenstein adopted the Swiss franc as its currency and gained access to a larger and more stable economic system that allowed trade and employment to grow again. Many expensive administrative functions, from transportation to postal services, were also handled by Switzerland. Still, deeper reforms were needed. Prince Johann II began selling family treasures, including valuable artworks, to repay the country's debts. Stability returned, but Liechtenstein still lacked capital, technical expertise, and a large population to compete industrially with its neighbors. Then something remarkable happened. The principality began thinking creatively about its future. A new constitution expanded political participation. Taxes were reduced almost to zero. And new laws created an extremely favorable environment for business. The most controversial innovation involved so-called domiciled companies, firms registered in Liechtenstein that did not necessarily operate there physically. It was an economic masterstroke. Foreign entrepreneurs could register companies in Liechtenstein, pay very low taxes, and avoid higher tax burdens in their home countries. For Liechtenstein, it meant revenue with almost no additional cost. The number of registered companies quickly doubled. At the same time, the country invested in infrastructure. Prince Johann II took a major risk by financing the first hydroelectric power plant to support industrial development. A second national bank was created and became a safe haven for companies fleeing instability in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany, offering financial secrecy and stability. For a moment, it seemed Liechtenstein was on the road to success, but history intervened again. The Great Depression, a major financial scandal, a devastating flood, and finally the outbreak of World War II all slowed the country's development. Yet paradoxically, the war almost created new opportunities. While much of Europe was engulfed in conflict, Liechtenstein avoided direct destruction. Meanwhile, Switzerland, preparing for a potential invasion, mobilized much of its workforce, creating labor shortages in Swiss industry. As a result, several companies moved parts of their production to Liechtenstein. Within a few years, the tiny principality saw the emergence of factories producing precision tools, engine components, and even ammunition. Although residents still suffered wartime shortages and food rationing, Liechtenstein emerged from the war relatively intact, unlike much of Europe. And while its path to prosperity was far from complete, one thing had become clear: Liechtenstein had found a way to turn poverty into the foundation of extraordinary wealth. After World War II, Liechtenstein entered what can only be described as one of the most remarkable economic booms in modern history. But how could such a tiny principality pull this off? To understand it, we need to look at several factors that were unique to Liechtenstein and how they interacted with the global forces of the time. First of all, Liechtenstein is extremely small, about 61 square miles. For most of its history, being small meant vulnerability, high defense costs, or the constant risk of being absorbed by the stronger neighbors. But in post-war Europe, this weakness turned into an advantage. Take tax revenues from so-called domicile companies, firms registered in Liechtenstein but operating elsewhere. In large countries like Germany or France, taxes from a few thousand such companies would barely matter when spread across millions of citizens. But in Liechtenstein, where only about 12,000 people lived in the 1950s, that income had a massive impact. It allowed the country to keep income taxes extremely low while funding public services with revenue from foreign companies. At the same time, Liechtenstein continued its customs union with Switzerland, meaning many expensive administrative functions could be handled by its larger neighbor. This kept government spending low while residents still enjoyed high-quality services. The country's small size also made governing easier. In a nation of only 12,000 people, it was simpler to implement policies quickly and maintain accountability. Corruption was harder to hide and less attractive because the potential gains were relatively small. After a brief period of political tensions following the war, Liechtenstein's leadership united around one goal: stability. Combined with pro-business policies introduced earlier, this stability helped attract foreign investment. Geography also became less of a barrier. Advances in transportation, energy, and communication after the war made the world smaller and reduced the disadvantages of being a small mountainous country. Timing mattered as well. Europe needed to rebuild after the war, and the United States poured enormous resources into the continent through the Marshall Plan. Demand for financial services and industrial goods surged, and tiny Liechtenstein suddenly found itself connected to a rapidly growing global economy. Having avoided direct wartime destruction, the country entered this new era with functioning infrastructure, industrial knowledge, and fresh investment. These factors allowed Liechtenstein to develop a surprisingly strong industrial sector. With such a small population, however, it could never compete in cheap mass production. Instead, it focused on highly specialized, high-precision manufacturing in small volumes. The process began with machine components and industrial tools, then expanded into precision instruments, dental equipment, pharmaceuticals, and advanced electronic sensors. What truly pushed these companies to the top was the environment in which they operated. The government rarely subsidized industries, and because the domestic market was tiny, about 95% of the production had to be exported. Survival required international competitiveness. The result was an industrial sector known for innovation, resilience, and efficiency. Today, Liechtenstein dominates several specialized markets, despite its size. For example, the country produces around 20% of the world's dental prosthetics, and there's a good chance that some of the tools used by your dentist were made in Liechtenstein. For the citizens of the principality, this meant one thing: well-paid, high-quality jobs. But industry alone didn't drive Liechtenstein's economic miracle. Its success also relied on the rapid growth of the financial sector and its emerging reputations as a tax haven. In the 1970s, the country's political stability, neutrality, close ties to Switzerland's monetary system, and extremely strict banking secrecy laws began attracting some of the richest people in the world. From corporate executives to far more controversial figures, many chose to store their wealth in Liechtenstein's banks. While some of these activities raised moral questions, most financial operations were entirely legal. Liechtenstein specialized in managing trusts, holding companies, and complex international business structures. At the same time, the number of registered companies using its favorable tax rules exploded to more than 50,000, more than twice the country's population. For the national budget, this was transformative. The principality could maintain extremely low taxes while still funding excellent infrastructure, education, and healthcare, all without accumulating national debt. And just when it seemed Liechtenstein had reached the limits of its success, another wave of growth arrived. Joining the European Free Trade Association in 1991, and later the European Economic Area and the World Trade Organization in 1995, opened even more economic doors. While many countries struggled with debt and political instability, Liechtenstein quietly continued growing stronger and proving that even the smallest state could compete globally. The results were immediate. Industrial production expanded so quickly that the country's own population was no longer large enough to fill available jobs. Liechtenstein became a net importer of labor, and today nearly half of its workforce commutes daily from neighboring Austria and Switzerland. This helps explain why the country has one of the highest export values per person in the world and a massive trade surplus. Meanwhile, the financial sector expanded even faster, solidifying Liechtenstein's position as one of the richest countries on earth. But great success also brings attention. International organizations began taking a closer look at Liechtenstein's financial system after several leaks and scandals suggested the country had become a center not only for tax optimization, but also for money laundering and tax evasion. As a result, Liechtenstein was placed on an OECD blacklist and forced to introduce major reforms. In 2009, the country weakened its strict banking secrecy laws, a move that shocked many clients and initially slowed economic growth. Yet Liechtenstein adapted quickly. Even without the old secrecy rules, it remained an attractive place for legal financial services and international business, and the economy soon stabilized again. Today, the country's statistics are remarkable. Liechtenstein has one of the highest incomes per person in the world, extremely long life expectancy, and top rankings in global development indexes. Its citizens enjoy excellent healthcare and education while paying relatively low income taxes. Despite the high cost of living that comes with limited spaces in such a small and wealthy country, unemployment remains around 1% and crime is extremely rare. Opportunities in both industry and finance remain plentiful, offering high wages and strong job security. The number of companies registered in Liechtenstein now exceeds 70,000, nearly twice the country's population, creating enormous tax revenues that support infrastructure, innovation, and very high quality of life. Liechtenstein's transformation from a struggling Alpine territory into one of the most prosperous places in the world shows how effective institutions, pragmatic economic policies, and well-timed reforms can outweigh geography and natural resources. Luck and controversial financial practices played their role, but the country's success ultimately came from long-term political stability and a government willing to adapt to global economic changes. Today, Liechtenstein stands as a remarkable example of how even the smallest nations can achieve extraordinary economic success.